I have a strong belief that countries that mandate national service when men and women turn 18 actually build a much stronger sense of community around country, and also expose people to a variety of beliefs and different cultures, etc. And there's a marked difference in maturity between those people who go through that process and those who don't. I think in the U.S., when we ended mandatory military service 50 years ago, was actually a major mistake in the United States. And when I say about service, I don't actually mean military service. I mean any type of service, whether it's public service in teaching or working in hospitals or volunteering for a branch of the military service. Actually, if I could be president of the world, I would mandate that for every 18-year-old. I think it really is part of the maturity process of learning that your small social group as you grew up was not the entire world. In my case, I ended up in the U.S. military when I was 18 and in the middle of a war zone, which I don't recommend for everybody, but it certainly gave me a competitive edge when I became an entrepreneur. I remember people when I hit Silicon Valley saying, "Do you know how risky it is to, your company to go out of business?" And I still remember thinking, well, I just came from a place where failure meant you could die. And obviously I wasn't the only one who had that experience, but it certainly gives you a different perspective. And I had been dealing with world's largest bureaucracy, and figuring out, and so I had even in my entrepreneurial career, it gave me an edge, and I think emotionally it made me grow up a couple decades in a few short years. Some people have this a natural tendency to want to serve, and others want to serve themselves for a while. And some people have religions that mandate service. If you're a Mormon, you spend a year in service in some foreign country when you're young, and so I think people ought to kind of start thinking about it. And as I said, for some people it comes naturally, that at some point in your life you want to figure out how to serve God, country, community, family, some or all or whatever. But if you haven't done any of that, then you're, I think, kind of living an unfulfilled life. And I would suggest you do that as early as possible, because as you get older, there's a phase in your life where you have so many commitments, you have kids, you have jobs, you have mortgage, etc. And then you might be able to do it later in life, which is just fine as well. But then the types of adventures you could have when you're 65 are very different than the ones you could have when you're 25. So I think this notion of you need to serve somebody or something ought to be baked into people's heads, and I'm not sure we teach that in a way that gets embedded. As I said, different cultures, different countries, different religions have different emphasis on it, but I think it's pretty important in living a kind of a well-rounded life. In the capitalist system that we've kind of built, um, building social media apps have a lot more kind of marketing power than curing cancer. Um, Unless you're more attuned to the fact that saving lives is probably a better way to spend your life. In my own family, my daughter had been in selling e-commerce stuff for the first part of her early career, and finally woke up and said, well, it's like selling sugar to diabetics. Maybe I ought to do something better. And she's now head of sales of a medical AI company curing skin cancer. And while she's still in sales, she made a conscious decision to do something to kind of better people's lives than not. I think we need to do a better job as educators. I think the governments and the countries need to be much more involved in actually putting their thumb on the scale and pointing people to possibilities they might not even know about. Because when you're young, you're influenced about what you hear or what you read from your peers, and you don't even know these opportunities are available. and you don't even know the cost of doing one versus another in your life. Um, and yeah, nothing would make me happier if we had a lot less social media apps and a lot more life science apps or things that brought us together rather than kind of tear us apart. I think COVID helped a lot of people wake up about kind of reevaluating your lives, about how do you want to spend your time. And and the fact that, who are these people who created vaccines in a year when it used to take a decade? She was pretty smart and reading and thinking about a career change anyway. And being locked down in London where she is allowed her to start thinking about different opportunities. And in her case, she had her father, at least when she asked, weighing in with his opinion about how would you like to, I think that I have friends now at my age who look back at their careers and say, well, I coulda, I shoulda, I woulda, etc. And I lived my life, so I don't think I could ever look back and say coulda, shoulda, woulda. I did everything I wanted to do, and proud of maybe at least 95% of it. That's what I remind everybody, including my own children, is you don't want to look back because your career is finite. When you're young, it seems like the road is infinite in front of you, but there are maybe just about 15,000 days in your working career, maybe less. You want to look back and say, I not only had fun or made money or whatever, but I made a difference. Um, and looking back and saying I wish I could have or I should have did it is kind of the wrong time to do that. And so getting some perspective when you're in the middle of it is admittedly hard, but it's worth putting some time and thought. And to answer your question again, COVID, I think, provided a lot of people the opportunity to kind of reflect and think about new careers. And as we're starting to get out of it, at least in the U.S. and maybe in some countries and others, we're going back into it. It is a time for everybody, I think, to reflect about, is this the career you want? To be able to look back at and said, this is how I spent my useful time. At Stanford, when COVID kind of started shutting down a lot of businesses, we created a whole new series of classes called Hacking for Recovery, helping mostly small businesses think about new business models, how to recover, how to manage change, etc. And so that was kind of our contribution. I've spent more and more time trying to work with governments, trying to think about the nature of innovation and entrepreneurship as changes in the global environment are occurring at a pretty rapid rate. And as you know, government organizations change at rapid rate is the antithesis of what they know how to do. And what's really interesting is, of course, when that happens to companies, existing companies, if they don't keep up, they go out of business. But countries can't go out of business. They could fail, or they could no longer be players on the world stage if they don't innovate at the speed of the change around them. And so that's what I'm trying to help Western democracies do. One of the public things we've done is we took a version of the class I started called iCore Lean Launchpad, which had been adopted by the US government to commercialize science in the United States, and used the exact same class format, but excuse me, went out to our Department of Defense and other agencies and created a program called Hacking for Defense, which allows students in research universities to work on some of the toughest problems the country has. But that turned into hacking for diplomacy, hacking for the environment, hacking for nonprofits, hacking for energy, etc. And so that framework ended up being incredibly useful to work on large problems that were not necessarily a startup you wanted to build or science you wanted to commercialize, but things that might be of national or even local interest. I've seen most of them fail because they don't actually understand the problem they're solving. It's the point I'm trying to make. It's less so the public-private partnership. It's more about the problem definition on day one. You have lots of people spending lots of money doing lots of things without actually figuring out what is the root problem. Almost 95% of the activities I see are actually people trying to solve symptoms of problems without trying to spend the time figuring out the problem. And I know the question you're asking, but I'm just saying it's an irrelevant question, at least for me. It's less so whether it's public or private or public-private. Most of them haven't spent the time and energy to actually do a deep dive about, is this the root problem? And almost always and I don't mean to, this goes back to service, to denigrate the people who passionately want to do X or Y. But yeah, I want to solve X. I want to solve the climate. I want to solve whatever. Well, is that the real problem? Well, of course that's the problem. Well, almost never. It happens to believe what you believe the problem is, but problems like that are inherently complex, have multiple players, and if you dig deep enough, you actually could find that maybe this one piece or these several pieces could be the linchpins of making major change, rather than trying to raise tens of billions of dollars. Just doing X or Y might actually make the most change. Passionate people who want to, particularly when you're young, but you still make the same mistake when you're old, want to throw themselves into X and Y, find actually doing problem definition actually incredibly boring. And oh, that's not the exciting part. Well, yeah, well, good luck. Go spend the next 5 years beating your head against the wall, because I can look at my watch and tell you where you're going to end up. Doesn't mean I don't want you to be passionate. I want you to be thoughtful about how you're going to be passionate. And sometimes those two things are, the Venn diagram, that's the null set. Being passionate about trying to change the world versus figuring out which part of the world do we want to change first are not the same thing. I got invited to at least help a group in Ghana, I think, who was drilling wells, to provide clean water to villages, finding out why it wasn't successful, that people were still dying of, diseases based on, unclean water. And well, how are you guys measuring success? Well, the number of wells drilled. Well, have you gone back and seen what happened to the wells? Well, what do you mean? We drilled the wells. We provided them. So I said, why don't you spend some time and have a researcher go out, and they drilled like 325 wells. They found out that like 3/4 of them were actually filled back in. Well, why? Well, it turns out that in the villages they were working with, they never did a sociological study. And if they did, they would have found out that the social construct of those villages is that in those communities, the village chief's wife was the one who was making money, like selling water. And when you made a public well, you kind of dried up her income, which dried up the chief's authority, and so they just filled the well in. All they had to do is figure out that she was the power center and make her in charge of the well, which they eventually did, but they wasted 7 years. And so I use well drilling as an example. It wasn't that the goal was wrong or the activity, but they confused the activity of drilling the well as the outcome. The outcome wasn't to drill a well. The outcome was to understand what it required to provide clean water without destroying the social system.